Last month, I went to Japan for the very first time. But instead of going to Tokyo or Kyoto or even Osaka, my wife and I decided to go to Fukuoka, mostly so we could hop on a train to Yufuin and go to a traditional Japanese bathhouse. That was the goal, and the budding photographer inside of me was absolutely ecstatic because every single vlog, video, or even photo I've seen that has come out of Japan is just absolutely beautiful. So I did what I do best and gave myself a terrible headache trying to decide what the absolute perfect kit would be to bring with me on this trip. I spent days agonizing over what lenses and accessories to bring with me. Despite the fact that I was only going to be there for a very short 4 days, as most of my trip was going to be spent seeing friends and family in South Korea, and also despite the fact that this was going to be a vacation and not a photo shoot or a video shoot, I still spent days overthinking it. And I know part of the reason I was overthinking it so much is I wanted to strike the best balance that I could between a simple kit and a powerful kit, which could be any number of different possible combinations of gear. So I overthought it, but I ultimately decided on the DJI Pocket 3, the Creator Edition, my DJI mic set, a small tripod, a variable ND filter, a circular polarizing filter, the Fujifilm X-M5, and my 2 budget primes, the Viltrox 23mm f1.4, which is a 35mm full frame equivalent, and the Viltrox 56mm f1.7, which is an 85mm full frame equivalent. And after an incredible trip, I wanted to chat about why I took these 2 lenses in particular, my experience shooting with them, and also how they surprised me. Basically a conversation that I kind of wish I could have with a slightly younger version of myself, the me 5 years ago, who was first getting into photography and videography. Starting with why I chose to bring primes with me over my more versatile zoom lens. Now, the fact that I agonized over which lenses to bring at all is admittedly silly because I only own 3 lenses. These 2 primes and the 15 to 45mm kit lens that came with my Fujifilm X-M5. But I know myself pretty well at this point, especially when it comes to taking photo and video, so I knew that if I took all 3 of these lenses with me, I would either lean very heavily on the zoom lens for its convenience, or there would be one lens that I didn't end up using at all. Neither of which I wanted to be the case. I am a fan of the 15 to 45mm kit lens that comes with a lot of Fujifilm cameras. I think that it is small, portable, it's light, and offers a decent value for the cost you often have to pay for it, despite all of the cons that come with it being a cheaper lens. But on this trip, I really wanted to push myself out of my comfort zone and also away from familiarity, like away from the stuff I'm used to doing. So with that in mind, I was already leaning towards taking the primes with me. I also knew that I wanted to get a few night shots, so having a little bit of extra flexibility with wider apertures was definitely something I wanted for this trip in particular. So I committed to bringing 2 primes with me and landed in Fukuoka. Fukuoka ended up being a dream to shoot. The cute taxis, the pops of color, the bikes, the lighting. It was just an absolute pleasure to take photos there. And the fun continued as we made our way into the countryside on this cute bumpy train called the Yufuin no Mori. It's not particularly a slow scenic train, but it does take you through some beautiful scenic countryside and right to the main street of Yufuin, where the moment you get off the train, you are looking at just a gorgeous mountain. Even before you leave the teeny tiny train station. I was, however, just immediately shocked at just how many tourists were there. I don't travel a ton, but I've been to big cities, and I've been to tourist attractions in Seoul or somewhere. It's normal. There's like places where you know there's going to be a lot of foreign tourists or even domestic tourists, but I didn't expect like this small, rather remote village to be just brimming with tourism. And it wasn't particularly hard to understand why. I mean, it was gorgeous. The mountains, the town, there's this street where you can actually see the hot spring, like hot water rushing below your feet as you approach just a beautiful shrine on a small lake. I honestly felt a little uncomfortable because of this. It kind of felt like I was wandering around someone's backyard, so I tried to be really mindful and look for, once again, a balance between capturing the just stunning beauty of Yuhuin and also respecting kind of the locals' privacy in a way. I tried not to get photos of people's faces or what felt like private homes or private property, and that's just a line in the sand that I draw. I know everyone has like their own ideas of what they want to photograph and what they think is okay to photograph. But that's just me and kind of my own code of ethics when it comes to taking photos, at least in this particular situation. Anyway, we got to the traditional bathhouse. We thoroughly enjoyed the hot springs. Those were absolutely incredible. The water was definitely different than the water at home. We got to lounge around in these absolutely adorable yukata and had this crazy dinner that was some of the best, freshest food I think I've ever had. Took some beautiful walks around the property, made some popcorn, enjoyed the cutest little glass of milk in a bottle the very next morning, and we definitely had just a thoroughly great time. So after a little more incredible food, we went back to Fukuoka to enjoy one last night in Japan and returned to Korea. So after using these two budget primes periodically over the last couple months, but then taking a couple hundred photos while I was in Japan, I feel like I've learned a lot about myself, the photos I take, and then also, and obviously, these lenses. And the first thing that I think I have to address is the fact that I took a ton of terrible photos. Poorly framed, underexposed, overexposed, out of focus. There was just a lot of user error on this trip. And that's in part because I wasn't on a photo shoot. I was on vacation. I wasn't being particularly careful. I left my photo dial to be in full manual because that's what I'm used to. But in doing so, I often didn't adjust my settings quite enough for each scenario or lighting situation, which is, I think, part of the learning process, and my learning style is definitely a kind of sink or swim and learn while failing kind of approach. So it was to be expected. If I had been a little more careful, I'm sure I would have walked away with a few more keepers and maybe even favorite photos, but I didn't. Whoops. I did, however, have the opportunity to get really familiar with the Viltrox primes, and as I kind of dive more into my experience with these two lenses, I thought it might be a good idea to first address why I bought the primes in the first place, basically why I chose Viltrox over the competition. When I shot with a Sony FX30, I used native Sony lenses and Sigma lenses, and I loved them. I had absolutely zero complaints when using these lenses and could easily recommend them to anyone who asked me if they were worth it. However, for many of the same reasons that I switched from the Sony FX30 to the Fujifilm X-M5, I wanted to give Viltrox primes a shot. For a long time, I definitely had this fear of missing out when it came to gear. I thought that I really needed to invest my money into the most expensive gear possible because that's what would be, I guess, the best ROI for my money. But as I've gotten better at photography, as I've gotten better at making videos, just as I've used gear more, I've kind of been able to get over that fear a bit. And when I was switching to the Fujifilm X-M5, I decided to go all in and give budget primes a shot. I wanted to see how much value I could get out of cheaper gear. So after watching a ton of reviews and comparisons, probably way too many, I did decide to go with the Viltrox lenses. Not only are they nearly half the price of more premium competitors like Sigma, I felt that their value to cost ratio was pretty high when compared to these more expensive friends. They seemed to be decently fast, sharp, and quick with autofocus. Not to mention they were smaller and lighter than my previous lenses, which to me is a benefit. And truly, carrying around cheaper gear just does so much to put my own anxieties at ease. So I ultimately decided to pick up my two favorite focal lengths in Viltrox primes. The Viltrox Autofocus 23mm f1.4 XF lens version 2 has a durable metal construction, a focus ring, and an aperture ring. It's not weather sealed, but it does have a micro USB port to update the firmware. It currently comes in brand new at $299 in the US. And first of all, I am so glad I brought this lens with me. The Viltrox 23mm was an excellent focal distance for my entry into urban street photography. It often felt like it was just wide enough to capture what I wanted, while being close enough to still get a good focus on a particular subject. So the 23mm basically lived on my camera for probably 85% of the entire trip, including when I was in Korea. And while I often had to walk towards a subject to get a specific framing, I really can't recall any time when I couldn't get far enough away to frame the shot I wanted. So after the trip and looking at my photos, I really felt like this was a great all-around wander the city with one focal length kind of lens. However, I was on occasion frustrated because I couldn't get the lens to focus, even in a manual mode, only to realize that it wasn't the camera or the lens or the mode, but the focusing distance. The minimum focusing distance for the 23mm is almost 12 inches, and being so used to snapping up-close photos with my phone, I occasionally found myself confused as to why I couldn't snap a very cute picture of my adorable latte or a delicious meal at 6 inches away. But once I realized I was just taking my photos too close to the subject, backing up did the trick. I just had to keep reminding myself that I wasn't taking photos with my phone and that I needed a little more distance between the camera and the subject. Which was really only a problem when I was trying to take more like daily life photos, like the meal I was having or the cute coffee. In general, the focusing performance was pretty great. I do imagine that more premium motors or even cameras will feel snappier if you're really testing them side by side, but the performance was good. In general, I never felt like it was lacking, but I do primarily shoot in a spot single autofocus mode, so these lenses were not really looking for the subject on their own, which I like, and I thought it was really good for street photography, but spot single autofocus was way less useful when I was trying to snap these little birds that came so close to me because they kept hopping outside of my little box. And this is part of the reason why I'm trying to not label this video as a review, because I'm not fully testing all of the different situations that this camera might encounter. I'm not taking down the guardrails and looking at the autofocus performance. I just want to share my experience, the way I actually use my camera. Unsurprisingly, this lens did struggle a little in low light, especially if I was underexposing the image or it was too dark to really properly expose the image with my current gear, because I do shoot handheld and that does limit my ability to reduce my shutter speed for more light. Having the aperture ring on this lens was particularly helpful when paired with the XM5 though, because the aperture shares this front wheel with ISO. So when I use this lens, I don't have to toggle between the two. I can use the aperture ring to adjust my f-stop and then use the wheel to adjust ISO, which I absolutely loved because I shoot mostly in manual. There is a bit of chromatic aberration or color fringing where we get these touches of purple in high contrast scenes. And I do think that some photos or setting combinations were worse than others, but I didn't find it that bad in practice unless I was zooming in and looking for it. I love high contrast, and there was really only 1 or 2 times where I felt like it was noticeable, which is also part of why I like to do my first deep dive with gear in the ways that I actually use it. That wide 1.4 aperture really did come in handy when exploring this awesome Showa era museum, which showcased this very fun and nostalgic view of 20th century Japan. I got a bunch of really cool photos there, but many of which are grainy because it was truly dark in there. But the grain really doesn't bother me. I rather have a grainy photo of this cute sign than no photo of this sign at all. So overall, very grateful to have those extra stops of light on this prime lens. And once again, just in general, despite being in a tight space, I never really felt like the lens itself was too tight. So the 23mm lens, a 35mm full frame equivalent, ended up being just a very nice all-around lens to carry with me while I was on vacation. The Viltrox autofocus 56mm f1.7 XF lens has a lightweight plastic design at 171 grams, which of course does feel cheaper, but it still feels quite solid in my opinion. It definitely feels more robust than the 15 to 45mm kit lens from Fuji. It's nice, it's small, has one single focusing ring, and a USB-C port for updates. Now I figured that I would enjoy the 23mm prime, but it was actually the 56mm that truly surprised me. It was definitely a little bit too tight for a lot of environmental shots that I would have wanted to take while on vacation, so there were quite a few times when I found myself quickly switching over to my 23mm lens for a particular shot or framing. But when the framing was good, the shots just came out incredible in my opinion. There's just something really magical about that 85mm equivalent focal length and compression. I definitely took fewer shots with the 56 because of that restricted field of view, but I feel like almost all of them came out really well. And I wish I had been able to take more shots with it, because it does just have a certain quality that I really enjoy. Thanks to that lower 1.7 aperture, I was also finally able to take a few of those night shots that I really wanted to. In particular, I think this food stand came out really well. In fact, all 3 of the photos I took of this food stand are in my top favorite photos from the trip. But in practice, my experience with the 56 was pretty similar to the 23. The autofocus was mostly snappy. It definitely struggled more in low light compared to good lighting. It also does take a great portrait in my opinion. These were not taken in Japan, but I think they're worth sharing because I've walked away with quite a few really nice portraits with this lens. And perhaps because I used this lens a lot less, I didn't really notice any color fringing, but it's like I keep saying, I didn't really take these lenses out with a list of tests to run. I took them with me on vacation, I took a couple hundred shots the way that I typically shoot, and I was genuinely impressed and surprised by the results. When I sold my Sony and Sigma lenses, I was genuinely nervous switching over to cheaper alternatives. But there truly wasn't a single image where I thought, oh man, if only my camera or lenses were more premium, this would have turned out so much better. Or man, I definitely would have gotten that shot if I only had a Sigma. Or man, I definitely would have gotten that shot if only my camera setup was 2 times as expensive. Jokes aside, most of my failed shots were just mistakes of my own making. Like not using a high enough shutter speed, being in a less advantageous autofocusing mode, exposing incorrectly. But as an amateur photographer and a hobbyist, I'm really happy with how my images came out. And it was just so much fun being in the moment, looking at my surroundings with a photographer's eyes and being just deeply in the present as I wandered around Japan. That experience overall was incredible. I don't think for me that carrying more premium lenses or a more expensive camera body would have really improved the experience all that much. At least, not enough to justify the extra cost to myself. So more than an in-depth review, this video really serves as proof to myself that I don't need the most expensive gear or insane specs to walk away with what I feel were incredible shots and really made for an incredible experience. I'm also really glad I chose the primes. They were 100% less versatile than my zoom lens, but I feel like they gave me some extra light when I needed it, and also, in a way, simplified my creative choices with restrictions. I couldn't hide far away and zoom in. I could only reframe by moving my body and being intentional with where I existed inside the scene. And that engagement, that deep connection to the present, is part of the reason I've come to love photography so much. Which is a ton of rambling just to say, I don't regret my choices. Is that a terrible way to end the video? I obviously do very low stakes photography. I don't regret it. I don't regret bringing the primes with me. I don't regret buying the Viltrox lenses. But I do hope you enjoyed the video.